many thanks for organizing this symposium, and well, many thanks for hosting it, and for really having a plan B, because well, I think we are all a bit sorry that we didn't get the chance to meet in person, but it's still very nice to share my research and to see what's going on with the research from you and from others. So today, as you mentioned, I'm going to speak about my PhD research and a bit about my postdoc research, in which I do field scale characterization of soil structure, but a lot of oriented in monitoring and basically modeling. So an overview of my talk is, well, I'll speak about challenges, and then I'll speak a bit about seismic methods, electrical methods, and how this framework that I developed in my PhD can be applied to the problem of soil compaction by animal threading. That's pretty much the outline of my presentation. So the main research question, or it's a bit vague, but one of the questions that I want to answer with my research is how to use geophysical methods for field scale characterization and monitoring of soil structure. So this is a question that I had when I started my PhD, and this is a question that I have to say that I still have. I mean, I already developed a few things, and I have well, better ideas of what to do it, but still, it's still challenging, and it's still something that I'm working on, and still something that deserves further development. And I have to say as well that there are some other questions that have appeared in the way, but this is basically the main question that we want to answer, that I want to answer. So since I'm going to be speaking about soil structure, I want to introduce soil structure, which is basically can be related to how the grains are connected mechanically, and like how they are organized spatially in the soil. And inversely, this is also related to how pores are connected and how they are organized in the soil. What is very interesting about soil structure, and what makes it very difficult to follow and to assess and to characterize, is that it's changing. It's always changing, and it changes. Well, it changes basically in response to biological activity and agricultural operations and some other seasonal cycles, such as wetting and drying. One of the states of soil structure that we're interested in is soil compaction. So soil compaction, well, there are also some definitions of soil compaction. I always like to use this image to talk about soil compaction, because for me, it was very useful to try to understand a bit more what it means. So basically for me, soil compaction is a reduction of pore space. Then this reduction mainly appears in the big pores. So here you have a non-compacted soil and a compacted soil. And as you can see, the main differences is that big pores have disappeared in the in the compacted one. And also you see that there is some loss in connectivity of those pores. This will, of course, impact soil physical properties, and they are basically impact in different ways. And this is also why it's very challenging to characterize soil structure, because in soil compaction, because, well, you have all these properties that change differently. So here we have a comparison between physical properties from non-compacted and compacted soils in a log scale. So basically you have the bulk density and some other properties that are often of interest don't change so much. So you have total porosity and bulk density that relatively don't change really a lot. But then you have other properties such as gas and transport properties that change dramatically, but they also change differently. So you have the properties controlling water flow change in a different way to those controlling gas diffusion or air permeability. And you also have some changes in mechanical properties. So there are these many elements that basically are related to soil compaction, and that makes soil compaction so complex to comprehend and to characterize. Then, since you have the changes in these properties, you'll have also changes in soil functioning. And one of the main issues, and I just want to mention one for now, is that soil compaction, and due to the changes in the properties that I mentioned before, you have changes in basically processes happening in the soil, and compaction creates the conditions for greenhouse gases emissions to increase. So basically you have nitrous oxides emissions here. And I compare here some studies reporting increases of emissions due to soil compaction. So you see that soil compaction can basically dramatically increase emissions, which is a big problem. There are other problems that I won't discuss for the moment, but basically we are interested in studying soil compaction because of these type of things. Another issue that appears with soil compaction is that basically it's very difficult to assess what's the extent of soil compaction. Globally, it's one thing, and there are some studies attempting to report this, but even locally, it's not so easy to characterize and to estimate the extent and the degree of compaction of soils. So this is something that is quite of interest, because if we want to know what's the global impact or the local impact of emissions and environmental impacts, so we want to understand how soil compaction changes in space, and that's one of the things that we want to do. As you may imagine, these estimates are often based on traditional methods for characterization, and the main issue with this method is that they are based on soil sampling. And soil sampling is nice because it's detailed, so it offers detailed information of soils. Yet the main limitation is that, well, it's very spatially limited. It doesn't offer spatial support. So with that in mind, we thought of introducing geophysical methods, which is probably not something that is not very new. But we thought of introducing geophysical methods in a systematic way for soil structure characterization. And in this case, here with geophysical methods, what we basically can do is that we can try to understand larger scales, and we also can monitor. And there are many things that we can do with geophysical methods. The issue is that they only offer indirect information. So this is something that we want to overcome, and this is something that's is basically part of or an integrate part of my research, how to avoid or how to overcome the limitation of only offering indirect information from geophysical methods. Now, if we have a compacted soil that looks like this is an experiment in Zurich that we had, and then, well, we have here, you can see the compact tracks and so on. So basically the question is, how do we use geophysical methods to characterize this? Is really, it might look straightforward, but it's really not so straightforward. So even in these very controlled experiments, so we went there and monitor and basically measure electrical resistivity after the compaction event. And you can see that after the compaction event, well, you can see the signature of soil compaction. You have compaction at soil surface. So the compaction occurred perpendicular to the plane in this image. And then you can see that while comparing the treatments, you see a difference. You can even see the tracks maybe. You can see that compaction in the soil surface reduces electrical resistivity, and this after compaction. So you can see things. But then what happens if you go a few months after and measure the same thing? Well, might be that you don't observe much, and it might be that, yeah, I mean, this is not so definitive, and you may think that compaction disappeared, but this is actually not the case. It's just the case that the conditions are different, such that in this particular time, differences between compacted and non-compacted were not so visible, and that's one of the issues that we want to avoid, and that's one of the issues. And that one of the questions that we want to answer is when to monitor and how to, extract the most information of geophysical methods. And the answer for this question for me, or the road for answering these questions for me is integration. So we really need to build a framework in which we can integrate modeling of soil structure dynamics, then how this changes physical properties, how this impacts soil processes, soil states, and then ultimately how this can be related to geophysical fits that we measure in the field. And now after this, we can use these fields to constrain the whole process and to try to understand a bit more about each of the blocks here. This is quite challenging indeed, because, well, each topic here is a huge topic in itself. And just the fact that trying to combine them together is not so easy, but this is more or less what we try to do. Now, if we're going to combine all those things, it's important to remember that it's the same soil, and the same soil has the same seismic properties, electrical properties, hydraulic properties. All properties belong to the same soil. So it's very important to remember, and I try to emphasize that we try to model things in a way that is consistent for all properties. So we want to have consistency between all those properties because they all belong to the same soil. In particular, also, these properties are quite interesting because if we're measuring in the field, these properties impact water dynamics. And then water dynamics will ultimately impact the other properties when we measure in the field. So we want to particularly also understand these properties such that we can have a better idea of how or when to measure these and how is this going to change in response to this. And in that sense, since we're going to talk about consistency, I want to talk about this image. And basically during my presentation, the rest of my presentation, I'll be speaking about modeling of soil properties. And these soil properties are all based on this conceptualization of having two domains. So you have a matrix which has micropores, and you have what we call structure or macropores. And then some properties in this example, hydraulic conductivity changes, in transitions between matrix and micropores. So this is how it looks like. In this case, this is sensitive to the pressure head, but it doesn't necessarily need to be sensitive to a pressure head. Even if the pores are dry, you can have an impact of macropores in the responses. So that's important to keep in mind. With this, I'll pass to my two examples of seismic monitoring and electrical resistivity monitoring. First, I introduced the observatory. So basically, it's not so complicated. We have four treatments. We have vegetation and no vegetation, and we have compacted the full surface and non-compacted, so the control one. Then in this experiment, we compacted the soil in March of 2014, and then we monitor resistivity, seismics, and TDR data in these experiments. As you can see, you have the different density on the data. First, I will talk about seismic data, which was monitored in 2019, basically 5 years after compaction. So with seismic data, well, we want to use seismic methods to understand the mechanical impact of soil compaction. And with this, we developed these experiments in which we have a seismic source that is activated every 15 minutes. And then we have seismic sensors in which we measure basically the wave fields, pressure fields propagating through the soil. With this, we can actually try to infer some mechanical aspects of soil compaction. I spoke a lot about integration, and that was very nice. But then, we have to limit ourselves in some of our studies to parts of that big picture. And in this case, it's basically trying to understand how some physical properties, water retention, mechanical pore space, and the soil states impact the seismic properties or fields that we observe. And then in this pedophysical modeling here lays the interpretation of these velocities that we observe in the field as a function of these things. So now, if we go to the field and we monitor seismic velocities, what will be observing? So the main thing, before speaking about that, I want to speak a bit about some of the metrics of mechanical characterization of soil structure. So this is monitor both density data and penetration resistance as a function of years after compaction. You can see that we see an increase for compacted soil. So this is relative penetration and resistance and relative bulk density. We see an increase in both of them. And then we see some recovery. Yet after 6 years, we don't see full recovery for any of those. Now, if we go to the field and monitor seismic velocities, the first thing that we observed, and this is only the example for bare soil, but we observe it for all soils, is that the slowness, or the inverse of the seismic P wave velocity, it's actually quite related to the water content. So it follows the same trend. So seismic velocities are very affected by water content at this scale and at these depths. So we need to account for this in our model, and this is something that we do actually. And for doing so, there is basically this concept of suction stress that is related to capillary forces that maintain grains together in the soil, and that increases as water content decreases. And this is basically the same concept that maintains grains together in sandcastles. So this is accounted for. Probably most interestingly for us is the impact of soil compaction. So if I take cross plots of water content and P wave velocity, it's quite clear that compacted soils have higher seismic velocities than non-compacted soils. So we want to account for this in the model as well. And for doing so, what we do is that we basically rely in these soil rheology models that's basically predict increasing contact areas between soil aggregates as a function of compaction. So if you have a compacted soils, this area or this radius here will increase, and this will in turn increase seismic velocities. So we can play with this area or with this radius here in order to obtain the seismic velocities that we observe in the field. And this is pretty much what we do. So we try to infer this relative radius, basically the ratio between this contact radius and the radius of the aggregates, such that we can play a bit and displace these modeling curves for adjusting this to compaction. So this is model fit, and we fit this parameter to model our compacted and non-compacted soils. So basically what we learned here is that we can model this in this fashion such that we can obtain something that looks like this, which is a geometrical factor of soils. And this already offers a systematic way of assessing soil compaction by looking for this property. So now we can also even go a bit further and use those properties to obtain a volumetric strain that can be compared with volumetric strains obtained from bulk density data measured in the lab. In this case, here we have 5 years after compaction. The strain that we obtain from this geometrical model that I introduced before actually falls relatively well between in the trend that we observe from bulk density data. So some remarks of this is that, well, basically I would like to say that seismic methods are suitable for characterization of soil structure, and we see a strong imprint of soil compaction on our seismic velocities. So that's good. Now, I go to geoelectrical methods. Similarly, integration, we don't have the full picture yet, but we're getting closer. We want to see how soil physical properties impact soil processes, and then states, and then geoelectrical fields. So that's the aim. So in our observations, basically in this experiment, there are a few things. This is water storage measured in 2018, sorry. So this is 4 years after compaction. And the main things that I want you to notice here is that when you have a dry soils or dry conditions, you see a big separation between water storage in compacted soils and non-compacted soils. And this separation suggests that, well, compacted soils are drying a bit at faster rates than non-compacted soils. You also see it in the bare soil actually here. In the case of wet conditions, you can see that, well, they are more or less in the same level. They're more or less in the same level. So really the main difference happens when soils are dry. Now, how does this impact geoelectrical properties? So here I present the geoelectrical properties of the same period. Well, the monitor apparent resistivity for that monitor period. And what we can see here is that compacted and non-compacted soils clustered together. So you have in the bottom compacted soils, and then on the top here, you can see that these are non-compacted soils. So basically, you see that there is a drop in resistivity, which is something that we already observed before in the section that I presented. And then you have a temperature trend. And then when you have dry conditions, things become a bit more complicated. And then these two things overlap. So it's not so clear to understand what's happening here and which one is which one. But here, when you have actually wet conditions, you see this separation quite nicely. So now the question is, how do we interpret this? What do we do with this, or what can we learn from this? And basically for this, then, well, we have to model these things, or there comes the modeling part. And as I mentioned before, we need to be consistent on how we model these things. So we need to model geoelectrical data, compacted and non-compacted, consistently with hydraulic properties, and consistently with soil evaporation properties, which we think may play a big role here in this scenario. So I'll focus for now in geoelectrical data and how this is modeled, since this is the main thing of my talk today. So basically, for modeling geoelectrical data, we use differential effective medium theory. And in this case, this equation, basically, which is electrical conductivity inverse of electrical resistivity, is mainly depending on two properties. macroporosity and this exponent m, which are both connected to soil compaction in a way. This exponent m is basically related to connectivity of the macropores. So let's say for now that for constant water content, we have the non-compacted state here. So if we decrease any of these properties, you will see a decrease in electrical resistivity, which is an indication of compaction. So compaction will be happening somewhere here, 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 and it's not so easy to identify or know where compaction will be, but we can probably say that a compacted state will be here. So we'll see a decrease in 14%, and this is not so far from what we see in the literature. If we want to now check how these electrical properties change as a function of water content, we have compacted and non-compacted. And probably here, the main observations or the main things that I want you to notice is that if we take constant water content, we'll see a separation, which is something that we actually see in our data. So for a constant water content, we see a separation, a decrease in resistivity for compacted soils. And if we happen to be in some of these places with different water contents, we might still observe as the same resistivity, which is something that we also observe in our data, right? Now with this, we can infer the properties that I mentioned before to model our data. And this is basically what we do. I won't speak much about that, but I'll go directly to the modeling results. And in our modeling results, basically, we can reproduce with this modeling approach, we can reproduce the main trends in our data, at least qualitatively. We see that there is this separation between compacted and non-compacted. And then we also capture some of those dynamics and some of those closing and well, equalities between compacted and non-compacted in the drying scenarios. Main thing here to observe is that we can basically model these and obtain separation with this modeling framework. And we can even go back in the past and model with inferred properties for this period. We can model basically changes in electrical resistivity. And we see that, well, from after compaction, just right after compaction to 2018 and even 2021, we see basically the same changes. So this can already help us understanding how soil is recovering from soil compaction. And some remarks here is that, well, we're sensitive to soil compaction by electrical methods. That's something that we knew. And then we can model this as a decrease in macroporosity and connectivity, right? So a summary of these two studies and pretty much of my PhD is that, well, we can offer, well, geophysical methods offer clear signatures of soil compaction. And this can be modeled, and we can even reduce by combining these two, and we can even reduce the element of water content. So here, for the same water content, I plot the models that we inferred, and I plot the data that we infer for same water content, so P-wave velocity and electrical resistivity. And you see that, well, they fall in their respective model for compacted and non-compacted soils. So combination of methods is important as well. Now I'll speak about the application of these concepts to the problem of animal threading, soil compaction by animal threading, which is the topic of my postdoc research now. So we know that animal threading produces soil compaction. This is known. What we don't know is what's the temporal and spatial dynamics of these. And this is basically what we want to know. Now, integration, I come back to integration here. Since this is a modeling exercise, I'll try to do everything together and try to show you a picture of everything together, right? So for doing so, I'll focus on soil structure modeling. So basically, I developed this model for animal movement that's basically predicts how animal moves and then how they change ball density and how this changes as a function of time. Well, basically time and space, but also saturated hydraulic conductivity, right? And this model is integrated in this landscape model at Rothamsted, where we can basically model everything. We can model emissions, we can model nitrate cycling, carbon cycling, water flow, plant growth. Well, here basically we can model many things. So that's nice. So this model is integrated to this in such way that we can model, for example, here I model 18 years of grasslands. And I introduced 5 trading seasons in the spring. So each of these steps, here you have bulk density for a pixel in this image. And then you have how bulk density changes as a function of time. Each of these steps that you see is a trading season. So you see that there is an increase in bulk density according to each of the trading seasons, right? And I want you to notice here that with this type of modeling, we can predict some things such as yield and emissions. So basically, if we have the compaction, no compaction, so the control scenario is 100%, we can predict that if you have a very severe compaction, so in this axis is a proxy for soil compaction number of steps, we can predict emissions that increase 100 to 160%, and we can predict also yield that decreases. So this is important because with this we can start making predictions and trying to see which treatment is better. Now, how does it look like compared to other studies? Well, we see that at least in this exercise, we're not that far from the ranges that we observe in the literature. Now, finally, what's the impact of this? So let's say if we have the metrics of soil compaction as the saturated hydraulic conductivity, you see that the decrease places are here and here. So basically, these are the zones where you have the most compaction. And then since we have already some methods developed for predicting soil properties, such as seismic velocities and resistivity, we can translate those maps to maps of P-wave velocity and electrical resistivity. So here are spatially how they will be distributed for a given day. Then we see that, well, we are indeed sensitive to soil compaction. So this is a way to try to better understand the system, to try to have everything controlled, and to see how the map of electrical properties or seismic properties will look like when you go to the field. Now, how can we use this? Well, we can, for example, use it to compare wet versus dry conditions. Well, it's basically same way of modeling things. So we have a line for compacted, a line for non-compacted, a line for compacted, and then you can just start playing. And by having this integrated modeling, this allows to play with these things and try to understand when it's best to monitor and what's the expected results.
Alejandro,
So with this,
we'll have to stop now. So maybe you can go to the conclusions.
Yeah, it's just next slide. So conclusions, we have, well, basically perspectives. That's a lot of things to do. There are many things for further development, and well, basically there are many ways we can go, many different areas in which we can develop things. There are some efforts for doing that. There are so many people working on this. There's this catalog for geophysical studies. There is a seminar that Sarah is organizing that will be very interesting for sharing ideas and research. And I just finally want to thank my collaborators. Thank you, Sarah. I'm happy to take questions if